gefällt. Is that right? That's all the Norwegian you're getting, I'm afraid. You can't read that. So it says, is it possible to change the debate on housing and design? And we think it is. And I should just say in advance, I have a tendency to speak very quickly. So if I start speaking quickly, you need to say, stop, slow down, and I will try to do so. I also have a tendency to walk around, and I know I'm not allowed to, so I'll stay here. Now, I've got the message, don't worry. Now, if it's been a long evening, my speakers before me have been very dull. Very dull. So if you're getting a bit sleepy, I'm going to tell you now what I'm going to say, and then if you want a quick sleep, you can sleep through the next 3 hours. It was 3 hours, wasn't it? Yeah, 3 hours. Okay, the doors are locked. You can't leave. It's 3 hours. So if you want to sleep, this is what I'm going to say. I'm going to say that we're sort of specialist think tank and do tank, and I went mad 4 years ago and set up Create Streets, and we exist to do research into the links between design and urban form and popularity, well-being, where people are happy, long-term value and sustainability. We exist to work with neighbourhood groups on design and urban design. We exist, increasingly we're working with councils and with developers as well, I'll talk about that in a moment, and we exist to lobby for policy change. And actually, from a start, or a standing start, nearly 5 years ago now, we've actually now had quite a major influence on the national planning policy of England. So we're gently quite pleased with that. That's the first thing I'm going to say, for the first hour and a half. And then for the second hour and a half, I'm going to talk about our research. He's not smiling. He's worried I mean it. I do mean it. But for the second hour and a half, I'm going to just talk about some of our research. And the good news is that with the explosion of GIS data and urban information, the case for what we call conventional urbanism, which is not quite the same as traditional architecture, though there's an overlap, the case is getting increasingly strong in terms of what people like, in terms of where people are happy, in terms of long-term investment, and that's actually where I came to it. I used to be a banker, and a little less clear in terms of sustainability. So that's what I'm going to say. You can now sleep for the next 3 hours. So what is, I can't stand still, I just find it impossible. What is Create Streets? So we're a London-based social enterprise, and we have an associated charity, the Create Streets Foundation. Actually, I've said all this, haven't I? I've said all that. So look, here's some of our research. So these are some of our books. Some of them are downloadable. Some of them you have to buy. I did actually mean to bring a whole chunk with me in my bag, and I left my bag this morning on the kitchen table in London. So I'm afraid you can't get any of those. But the one on the top left, that's an exploration primarily of why people oppose new housing. We did what's called a literature review of all the evidence we could find in English or French, that's because those are the only two languages I read, as to why people oppose housing. The book on the top right, Beyond Location, that's the first ever study at book length of the links between urban design and value. And we did a study of every single property sale in 6 British cities in 2016 and did a multivariate analysis back. I'll come to that. If you can't wait, I'll come to that later. The bottom left is Heart in the Right Street, which is a study of the associations between urban form and well-being, where people are happy, and then that's a case study. This is our next book, coming in March. This is a study of the types of streets and square that people like. Where do people want to be? And we're working with a marvellous academic who's one of the Create Streets Fellows at the University of Warwick and the Alan Turing Institute. And she's got this marvellous algorithm, which we've worked with her to develop, which gives about a 90... Can anyone understand me? Is this making sense? Slow down. I said I need to slow down. Thank you. Keep saying that, okay? Keep saying that. Because otherwise it'll go on only for 2 hours, and we can't have that, can we? We did a marvellous algorithm which can prejudge which images people will say they like. And we dropped this algorithm using the marvellous thing called Google Street View. Do you have that here? Do you have Google Street View here? I knew you had Google Street View here. They've even got it in Finland and Sweden, I understand. We dropped it into 19,000 streets and squares, and then we said, and where do you like? And I'll tell you the results later. We also do urban design. So initially we did it mainly for community groups. This is one of the first ones we did, where we follow very conventional patterns of block, plot and lot. Increasingly, we're doing it for councils and for landowners as well. Initially, we also used urban design to make a point. So this is a big, what we call boxland site in Zone 2 London, and we showed how you could actually keep all of the existing retail or commercial space and wrap it again round with streets and conventional backs and fronts, and keep all the existing use and add on a whole chunk of new use as well. And then we ran economic analysis of that, which we then shared with the GLA, the Greater London Authority, and we've used that to help change planning policy in London. We do lots of work with community groups. I'll come to some of that in a moment. These are some of the reports that have come out of that. So we work for communities on what they want to see, and we use that to help them influence either the developer, the landowner, or the local authority. This is probably our first sort of big scheme that was quite prominent in the national and London press at a site called Mount Pleasant. It was called Mount Pleasant because initially there'd been a big pile of poo there, and it was ironically called Mount Pleasant in the 18th century. And then it became a prison, and then it became a post office. The post office has now sold it and wanted to build, is going to build, I fear, because we lost this battle, a very ugly and very foolish development. Sorry, I have to put that down. With blocks out like this because of light rules. So we worked with the local residents to come up with a different scheme that actually had more housing in it, slightly less green space, but differently articulated, and we got North Korean levels of popular support for it. So we got between 97 and 99% support in the local polling. I genuinely didn't run the polls, and there was more housing. The problem was, as one developer said, this is so annoying, he said here, very beautiful, you'll never get it through planning. And he was right, we didn't. And there are lots of reasons why we didn't, but one of them is by building conventional medium-rise streets, we broke all the bloody light rules. The fact that most of London breaks the light rules were put in initially in the 1920s, is just a passing insanity. Is this interesting? Because there's a lot more to come. We push ideas into the public debate. So we worked to suggest how lots of prominent streets in London could be turned into boulevards. So, hang on, that's what it looks like now, and there's a concept reusing the Euston Arch for how it could look. And we get these into the media, we get them publicly discussed, and we get them onto councillors' agendas. And then we run charrettes, inquiry by design, learned partly from the Princess Foundation, partly from organisations in the US. Here's a range of charrettes we've run, and we're running more and more of those, increasingly funded from the charity, which allows us to do it in less prosperous communities. We're also, in almost every workshop that we run, we do we call a visual preference survey, to understand what people want. So we don't just look at where things go, we look at what things should look like. And we get a very, very consistent, without exception, preference for what we would call conventional design, which is not quite the same as traditional design, but it's coherent, complexity, variety in a pattern, materials that fit in, sense of place. We can get incredibly strong support for housing or developments up to about 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 stories, and then it just completely collapses. So we can get 70, 80% support up until that level, and then we can't do it anymore. And that's why I think increasingly developers and councils are starting to come to us, because they realise we've worked something out. You want me to go faster? Faster. He wants me to go... So I'm sorry, I have to speak faster because I'm going to be too long otherwise. We've just kicked off a major programme which we call Place Champions, working with a London community enterprise called London Citizens, where we get ahead of the planning process. So they select where they want to work, we've got the funding to work with them, and we run a charrette, we do walking tours, I think I've got some photos of walking tours, we do a Know Your Place exercise, which bits of your area do you like, which do you dislike, which would you like to see improved. We then have a discussion about why they like or dislike them. And you don't need the education of architecture or urbanism, in fact you certainly don't need it. The people speak pure urbanism. It's innate. You talk to residents on an estate and they're all putting red dots, red means don't like, on a particular stairwell. What's wrong with the stairwell? Well, it's not controlled. Anyone can get there, anything can happen. What's wrong with that place? It's not in a street, it's ugly, it's windy. The themes that some architecture schools don't teach, but they all should teach, just come boldly out at you, as shining as the shining of shook foil. We do walking tours. What do people like? What don't they like? They didn't like that. It's rather windy. And we also teach them not to get cheated by development. Just because it says there's going to be some greenery or a tree doesn't make it a nice place. I didn't take that photo. That photo was taken by one of our participants, and I think she made the point very well. This is actually this is an urban design. It doesn't look very pretty, but this is an urban design that we did with residents in Peckham in South London, a very poor part of South London. And actually, it's really good urbanism. It was 50% us, 50% them, and they've got a really sensible thing. They've got plots, they've got a central square, they've got the desire lines going through. This is where the shop would go with gardens above. They've actually come up with a better scheme than BlackRock, one of the biggest fixed income investors in the world, will probably come up with. I'll jump over that. We're also very, very... I'm sorry, I just can't keep still. It's too difficult for me. Can you hear me if I do this just for a little bit? You sure? Thank you. We also are very interested in data. So 2 of the people in the team and 2 of our fellows around the world are urban morphologists. And we scrape the data on cities. How tall are the buildings? How far between them? Where are the trees? How old are they? Are they listed? Are they protected? How many shops are there? And we've got models for London and 5 or 6 other cities now. And we then use that to understand the cities. And we use that, we link that then to the scores. This is how we can score the impact on scenicness of investment in streets. This is a street quite near our office, where a few £1 million was spent, putting in trees, levelling the footpath, and it's become a nicer place. We've also created a tool working with a University of London called Street Score. It's rather hard to see. Street Score is driven by the big data, the algorithms, on connectivity, local and citywide, density, greenery, diversity of homes, facades, come back to that, urban blocks, land use, height, space and design. And we can use this metric, slightly depending on how we weight it, to predict house prices or to predict index of multiple deprivation. Index of multiple deprivation is a British metric for how deprived communities are. And we can predict how deprived communities are based on what the street pattern is like, based on street score. Because actually there are what are called sorting effects in cities. People move to the bits of cities they can best afford. Connectivity and what it looks like and feels like are absolutely crucial to that. Let me tell you a secret. These 2 elements here, we're trying to make them better. Design and facades. We drive that at the moment entirely off the age of the buildings, which we know with great specificity. That is the single most important metric in the whole score, other than connectivity. So how close it is to the middle of London really matters, and how old the buildings are. They are the most important drivers of value in the borough of Greenwich, where we've done this. We can't at the moment get any of the other boroughs to pay us to do it because they're not going to like the findings. Because what the findings are going to say is, stop what you started doing about 70 years ago. That's what it's going to say. It does say it. Just to give you an example, so this is street score. This scored this street. No human has touched this, and it got a score of 36. There's lots of greenery. Lots of the architectural schools tell you greenery is crucial, and it's important. But that's not a nice place to hang out. And this got a score of 70. Pretty nice place to hang out. And I haven't got the middle one. I'll jump over that. Now, the good news is, because we believe that, well, we don't believe, we are starting to influence reality now. It's not just us, it's not just me shouting in the dining room anymore. It was me shouting in the dining room for the first year. Well, my wife said, "Are you going to get a proper job again?" No, I will never get a proper job again. So this is, I'm not going to tell you where this is, but this is a workshop we ran just before Christmas in England, but for a council. And the chief executive and all the senior guys were there, and the project team. And it was, again, I'll be a bit vague about where it was, but it's because they own the land and they want to regenerate it. And we've just set working with them together, we've just set the principles and the priorities. I'm going up there on Tuesday to talk to all the elected councillors, and we've also been commissioned to write the design brief for the architect. So, we are now actually we've affected lots of places a bit, but we're now actually setting to write that. And I'm not an architect, I should say. I'm very pleased to say. And look, there's the pattern we came up with. It's very simple, it's very straightforward. It's a block pattern, clear backs and fronts. And there's a sketch that one of my colleagues, an architect, did on the train on the way back of how it would look and feel. And we're getting to a higher density than the horrific schemes they'd had done by a local architect. The other thing we're very interested in is regulation and rules. Actually, a lot of this started for me when I got out a lovely document, which if you're having trouble sleeping, I recommend you read, called the London Housing Design Guide. If any of you have insomnia, read the London Housing Design Guide. It will help. This is my house. Okay, so I know my house, and I measured it, and I compared it to the London Housing Design Guide. My house is illegal on 14 separate points. You can't build it. Now, it's an amazingly efficient way of building a house. Because it's tall and thin. It maximises the amount of house for the amount of space. And it has a small garden which works fine for medium-sized children. Now, one of the reasons, but the problem is lots of rules on stairs, width of corridor, level access, access to lavatories, and a whole bunch of other things, make it almost impossible, in fact, they make it impossible to build a house with that efficiency of use on that footprint. Here are some houses, actually they've now been built, this is a CGI. Here are some houses built about 2 years ago in West London, and they've got the same net area, usable area, as my house, and they're 2 metres wider. One of the reasons, obviously, to do with disabled access, which I have sympathy for, and it's an important point, but the data is misused. So we often have cited at as the overall percentage of disabled people in London. But that includes lots of people who can't hear or can't see or have other issues. My younger son is deaf. He's fine on the stairs. He has some issues hearing, but he's really fine on the stairs. So that's not to say we shouldn't worry about it, we absolutely should. But we do need to think about the trade-offs, and there are trade-offs. This is light rules, so here are some of the here's some of the most valuable housing in London. That's what you could now build, because you have to get 23.5 degrees up to the light. I'll jump over that. So this is some of the, we look at the regulation in real detail, because I'm a bit boring and I like the real detail. And then we try and put it all together and influence policy at the national, London and local council level. We focus on the national level, because that's where we can have the most impact. As you know, earlier this year, or at the end of last year in fact, the British government created a beauty commission, which got some issues, but it's going to put massively more focus on what buildings look like and popular support. More importantly, the new British National Planning Policy Framework has got very important statements on upfront engagement with communities and on the use of form-based codes, which should be popular. And those have never been there before. So those are 2 quite seismic changes to the planning process. Now, the fight isn't over. There's a lot more to do. But that is a non-trivial change. I won't list all the other stuff that we've done, but we believe we are having an impact. If you like our work and are very rich, the Create Streets Foundation, which is our associated charity, is always open for donations. And if in doubt, put another 0 on the end, or 2. And we've also very recently created Create Streets America, which is starting to do the same in America, and we've just launched our first survey there, and we're launching our second one soon. Right, that's all about us. Now I'm going to talk about our research. So that wasn't quite long enough, but the second half... No, you can't leave. He's leaving. He's had enough. This man, you should hear of. You probably haven't told us. It's called David Halpern. I'm not reading it to you. You have to do the reading bit yourself, I'm afraid. He's a very important man who runs something called the Cabinet Office Behavioural Insight Unit. Have any of you heard of a British politician called David Cameron? Do you remember him? I don't remember him. But anyway, he set this up. And this guy, David Halpern, who runs it, is a very important unit. And he actually wanted to be an architect. And he didn't become an architect because he was so frustrated at the lack of data about buildings and what people like and where and why and how. So our mission is to try and make that not true anymore. Could you all please put up your hands? Yes. Thank you. Now, what proportion of your... No, keep them up, you have to keep them up. What proportion of your health is a function of where you live, not who you are? Okay, take down your hands when I get to the number. 0, 10, 20, 30, 40, does anyone else? 50, 60. No, you have them up again. Okay, I'll stop. You were right at 40. About 40% of our health is due to where we live, and about 60% is due to who we are. How much we drink, how much we smoke, our genetics, whatever it might be. There are lots of ways this works. I won't go into too much detail. Actually, I'll jump over that. Now, developers know this is important Because developers use the words of traditional urbanism, but they just don't mean the same thing. So developers call this Vauxhall Gardens, but it's not a garden. That's a garden. And if they wanted it to be a garden, they'd call it one. Developers, they call this space here, this one here, they call that Malaysia Square. I checked with my 8-year-old. I think he was 6 when I checked. It's not a square. But there's a reason they call it a square. They want to imbue it with a character that it does not have. Developers, bless them, I hope you can cope with this English example, they call this Kidbrooke Village. But it is not a village. It is not a village. This is a village. The developers, actually, I know the architect of this horror. Actually, the architects, I should say, they describe this as human scale. Would you want to meet the humans who are scaled to this? They are lying. And this is my new favourite. The developers of this call it the Canaletto. It's not the Canaletto. It's a fucking tower. That's a Canaletto. I said this over lunch. Earlier this year, I took my boys to Venice for the first time, and to look at the look, and I mean this very seriously actually, of infinite wonder of my sons as they looked at the beauty of the Canal Grande, was to see something of profound truth. And I have also shown this picture to my young sons, and there was, ladies and gentlemen, no look of infinite wonder. Now, I should stop there. But the good news is no one believes this. Okay? So, in a survey that was commissioned with enormous amusement by the Royal Institute of British Architects, they discovered, just 10 years ago, 2/3 of people said they would never even consider buying a newly built house. There have been more recent surveys. Just under half prefer an old building, 20% prefer a new one. There was another one last year, which is not on this slide, went up back to about 60%. But this is absurd. You're not looking shocked enough. Think about it. Nothing else in the market economy other than antiques is better when it's 200 years old. It's genuinely absurd. So there must be something that we are profoundly not doing right. And this is it. Because the good news is we can learn. And I won't repeat myself. Connectivity, density, greenery, homes, facades, design, space, height, land use and urban blocks. If you understand the data on those, you can understand where people are happy, why, and what people will pay for. I won't go through all the data because I don't actually have another 2 hours. Greenery. I'll just say one thing about greenery. 2 things, maybe 5. Greenery is good for you. Looking out on greenery relaxes you. There was a marvellous piece of research done about 30 years ago by an American academic. It was a lovely piece of social science. 2 hospital wards, data over a period of years, was able to get pairs of patients in the 2 wards who were similar in age, socioeconomic status, and had comparable illnesses. One of the wards looked out on bricks, or brick wall, I should say, an ugly brick wall, and the other looked out on greenery. The patients in the ward that looked out on greenery, they got better faster, and they stayed better. So greenery does matter. And there's lots of data on this. But it doesn't always help. And if between you and your front door there's dark bushes that someone might jump out of you at, then greenery can lead to increased crime or to increased stress. The data on street trees is particularly strong. It may not be, the climate here may be different, but certainly in the UK, if in doubt, plant street trees. It has an impact on people's health equivalent to a £10,000 increase in income. Street trees are incredibly good, not just for the air, but for walkability. People walk more, people drive more slowly, and there are fewer accidents because there are the trees there that you might hit. That's why traffic engineers don't like them. Water also brings immense value to developments. I'm going to jump over stuff on suburbs, I think, but I will say something about tower blocks. There is a place for tower blocks. Some people like them, about 10 to 20% of people like them. They're more expensive to run, and you tend to know fewer of your neighbours. They work very well for rich people without children in city centres. Because unfortunately, for the rest of us, they tend to work much less well. We've looked at every single academic study looking at the associations between living in a very big building and well-being. How many of your neighbours you'll know, how your children do, your physical health, your mental health, are you depressed, blah, 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 blah. And what we found is just under 80%, I'm very sorry that you're yawning, I'm sorry, there's a lot more to come, I do apologise. Just under 80% find a negative relationship, even when you adjust for socioeconomic status, between living in a tower and well-being. About 10-12% find a positive relationship, and the rest find nothing at all. So there's not an absolute rule, they can work. Three key drivers of that, we think, impossible to be absolutely certain. It certainly makes bringing up children harder. It's harder for children to have unsupervised play outside. The inhuman scale seems to discourage people being nice to their neighbours. Now you can argue for ages about why, but there's quite a lot of data that shows this. I'll cite just one study, though I could cite others. Again, an American study where lots of this research is done on students sometimes, because you need to have comparable people. And students in first years of American universities tend to be randomly allocated to different buildings. So you can actually do quite nice experiments. They left wallets and requested charitable donations in different heights and different buildings. And they found that the smaller the building and the lower the people were by story, the more likely people were to return the wallet or make the charitable donation. Again, with statistical confidence. Crime, I'll jump up. Well, it used to be the case that big buildings were more heavily correlated with crime. That's not the case anymore. But the consequence of that is, I haven't got the slide, the consequence of that is higher management costs. Because you can make big buildings work if you porter them properly, control access, and invest in them. Okay, I'll keep moving. Density. Density is a big issue in London. Maybe, sorry, is it going on too long? Sorry, the watch has been looked at. Never let density be used as an argument for high-rise or very big buildings. The best way to achieve density, thank you. You should clap every few minutes. Feel free to do it all the time. Thank you. Stop. Okay. The best way to achieve density is finely grained. These are the two densest square kilometres in Europe. One is in Paris, one is in Barcelona. There is not a monstrous lump of building in sight. This is some urban design we did, which actually went to higher density than is currently being put on that site. The other thing about blocks is very important. So this is why I think it's not just about design. If you have conventional blocks like this, with clear fronts and backs, in very good data in Australia, and slightly less good data in the UK, that is meaningfully correlated, again adjusting for neighbourhood, with lower crime and lower burglary. It's the safest places in the city are a busy street or your home. The most dangerous place are those semi-private, semi-public spaces that post-war modernism created by default, and which I'm afraid to say even the good architects, certainly in the UK at the moment, are still creating. We see time after time space that is just nebulous. It's not a back, it's not a front, it's just sort of there. And I can get into the back of that person's garden. That is correlated with higher crime. I'll jump over this. Mixed-use areas is incredibly important. We've seen this in our research. One of the strongest predictors of higher value areas and areas where people most want to be are areas which mix uses. Housing, offices, shops. So Intabao, in your case for traditional design, make it a case for mixing up uses as well. Traffic is also incredibly important. Now, we had a discussion about this earlier. There's now been more recent research on this in the UK in Bristol a couple of years ago. But the most famous study on this was done in America about 20 years ago by a man called Appleyard. And he looked at 3 streets. One with that much traffic, medium and low. And he found there was a very strong relationship between the amount of traffic and the number of neighbours that people knew. The number of friends people had on the street. You can see it mapped there. That's light traffic, medium traffic, and heavy traffic, the number of friends people have. And by the way, how many people you know just in your daily life? The person you say hello to in the coffee shop, the neighbour that you say, hello John, how are you? Again, it has a meaningful and measurable impact, probably, they're all different, on your personal happiness. We need to know that the best neighbourhoods are ones where we can go into the public sphere and then retreat into the private sphere when we need it. Some people are sociopaths. Most of us need a bit of both. And the right urban design allows us to do both seamlessly effortlessly throughout the day. I'll jump over that. Just come back to steps, just to be provocative. As you know, I think I said it earlier, in many countries, I don't know about here, but in the UK, non-level access is now banned since 1999. And for good reason. I understand the logic of disabled access. There's a good and well-intentioned reason for that I support at one level. But as ever, the problem is in the data. There's only been one piece of study, one proper piece of research into what is the impact of non-level access onto personal health. Because here's the thing. Going down and up steps is very good for you. It's a very good way of getting daily quotidian exercise. Older people living in a city in Florida who did not have level access, in a longitudinal study, a study done over many years, they stayed physically fitter for longer because the steps were good for them. And there's huge amounts of evidence from office blocks showing that the offices with the best, fastest, biggest, brightest, shiniest lifts have got less healthy workers in them. It's a difficult trade-off. There's no easy answer to that one. Facades. Now we perhaps get into more conventional space for some of you. Now, facades really, really, really matters. Okay? This is a lovely piece of research done by Charles Montgomery of Happy City. Some of you may have heard of him. This was, I think it was done in Seattle. They got students to pretend to be lost tourists in front of these two buildings. And then they saw what happened. I think it's five? I think it's five. Yes. Nearly 5 times as many people spontaneously offered to help the lost tourists in front of that building versus this building. They're in the same part of the city. And similar multiples offered to lend them one of these or to help them get to where they needed to go. Now there's more. There's a market lady, some of you may know, called Anne Sussman. We're starting to work with her. And she's worked to create eye tracking technology. So these colours here show you what you look at in the first 30 seconds when you look at a building. Not you, but you'll be similar, because this has been done on lots of people. So the red means we're looking at it a lot. Yellow, blue, black, not at all. Okay? We look at things. We like to look at stuff. We like to be engaged. This is a rather silly looking building, but we look at the doors and the windows. But if you're given a glass facade, you look at the red thing there, or the bush over there, there's nothing for us to look at. We get bored. So Jan Gehl's, when he writes about people being bored, he's absolutely right. We just don't look at it. The mind is not a blank slate. Now, I haven't got slides on this because we haven't prepared them yet, but in our next book, we're looking at the evidence, the real neurological evidence on why we prefer buildings that have repetition in a pattern, buildings that are a bit symmetrical, and the data, the neurological data on how our brains work, the ease with which we interpret things that are sort of nearly symmetrical, faces, is incredibly strong. Literally, our brains work faster, and we can compute them more quickly. We find them more settling. We find them more reassuring. Here again, we don't look at things where there's nothing there. I'll jump over that. And places that evoke memories that are pleasing to us are incredibly emotionally settling. You can link them to lower blood pressure and to higher mental health. Some of you may recognise this. This is Main Street in Disneyland. Walt Disney was a very, very good urban designer because he wanted to make people happy. He didn't want to be trendy. Now, this is all faked, but it was done to evoke a perfect version of a remembered American Main Street. And there's been studies on this. People stepping into that street instantaneously get calmer, more relaxed, they feel happier, because the facade, the memories work together. Now, just because something should evoke some degree of happy memories doesn't mean it needs to look precisely like the past, but it needs to rhyme. It needs to have some of that facade pattern, some of that repetition. I've only got another 35 million things to say, don't worry. Is beauty subjective or is beauty objective? I.e., is it just something that's totally personal, or can we predict it? It's completely predictable. I can't tell what any individual one of you will think, but I can tell you what about 75 to 85% of you will think. I don't know who's in which percentage, but in all the research we've seen or done, you can predict a very high proportion of responses. This is the very first study that was done, that we've done more since, which are not in this presentation. This was done by an Israeli academic, Jordan Rov, some of you may know him, self-reporting where people felt good in the streets.
66%, I think, I can't remember, 66% of people's response was a function of where they were. The rest was a function of who they were. More articulated facades, greenery that wasn't frightening, lower traffic, were the predictable predictors of where people preferred to be. I can't remember this. In Gallup surveys of cities that people most like to be and where they're happiest, one of the strongest correlations, sometimes it's first, sometimes it's third, is between how attractive they find it and how much they like to live there. It's a better predictor than education, basic services, or safety. I'm not saying it's top. It doesn't matter if it's top or second or third or fourth, but it's incredibly important. We could argue a little bit about causation or correlation, but it's incredibly strongly there in the data. Here's another one. We find in an American survey of 27,000 responses, we get a 0.56 correlation between overall place satisfaction and what it looks like. Economic security, some of the standard things in politics come nowhere close. So this really matters, what places look like. This was a survey done actually by an academic we're now working with. She looked at 1.5 million places using photos uploaded on Tinder and other sites. Places that people found most scenic correlated with better health and better mental health, because you can get that data very locally. So this stuff really matters. You guys sitting here in this room today are not doing something obscure or unimportant. You are actually talking about the basic health and mental health of you and your fellow citizens. And you should be proud that you care about that, because it matters. Thank you. Here, this is a slight tangent. Here are two visions for humanity. Here are two London stations. Here's King's Cross, and here's Euston, built in the 1960s. These are performing the same function, but one of them is reaching for the heavens, and one of them is scuttling for the nuclear bunker. That is on the same urban block as that. Hands up if you prefer this. Hands up if you prefer that. I knew you'd say that. But the point is, even with less extreme examples, you get the same response. It's entirely predictable. This is again from Anne. There are no postcards of this building. Lots of postcards of that building. I'll jump over that one. Now, we've done polling. I haven't got all of it here, but I've got some. So this is the first bit of national polling we did in the UK. And I got into a lot of trouble in the architectural press on this one, I'm afraid. So we asked 1,000 people. First of all, we asked them, do you want to see new buildings built on a brownfield site near where you live? Brownfield means not fields, existing buildings. We got 62% said yes. And then we said, thank you. Do you want these? And the 62% went up to 75% or 73%, or down to 51, 34, or 23%. That's a 52 percentage points variety. The chief executive of Ipsos Mori, the polling company who did this for us, was absolutely staggered. He had not expected anything like that range. We wrote an article about it in the Architects Journal, and I then got 6 buckets of stuff coming towards me. Because, of course, what they spotted was that the one that came top was Poundbury, which is the one done by the Prince of Wales. But, bless them, the architects, and some of my best friends are architects, but bless them, the architects completely missed the point, actually. Because I said I'm not just making a case for traditional architecture, I'm making a case for rational architecture. This development here, Durenthorpe, in the north of England, which is contemporary, but it's got many of the same features as this. It's got variety in a pattern, human scale. It's scored nearly as well. So the point isn't that it needs to look exactly as if it was done 100 years ago. The point is that it's got to have certain components. Doing it as if it looked 100 years ago, or as traditional design, is a very, very good way of doing that. Very easy way of doing it. That's not a criticism. But it's not the only way. But there are certain elements that are necessary. Here's another one we did. We did ourselves this off our media feed. We asked people, what would you most like to see built? We got 87% for one of these two. We got 13% for these two. And then we did two things. Actually, I could have told you this on the previous one. These two buildings here, bottom, have between them won 13 architectural prizes. To be fair, that's not been built. That one has. It's won a big 0. We've not been able to do this again because people won't fill it in anymore. We also asked people what they did. What was their profession? Because we get quite a lot of architects and planners who follow us in social media, so we know. Of this 13%, half, 50%, oh no, 49% I think, were architects or planners or designers. I forget what the percentage was for that, but it was about 12 or something. So we found what we now call the design disconnect, which is the predictable difference in opinion between the majority of the population and professional designers. And this isn't the only piece of evidence, there's another half dozen pieces of evidence. Do you remember that man I cited, David Halpern? So he found the first piece. He did a lovely piece of research about 20 years ago where he asked students, he was actually looking at how much repeated exposure to an image changes your perspective of it. And he asked students to look at faces and buildings. The faces did one thing, but he found something strange and unexpected in the response to buildings, was that the groups of students were forming into two groups, a big group and a rather smaller group. So he looked a bit more, and he found, can you guess where this is going? That the smaller group, who had a completely different view to everyone else, were the architecture students. And it gets more interesting. The longer they had been architecture students, the more divergent they became from the rest of the student population. So the first year architecture students were actually quite like everyone else. But by the time they got to the 5th or 6th year, they were completely out somewhere else. And as I said, that's not the only piece of research on this. Jump over this and this. Here's some research we have literally just done. We've not published this yet. This is what we were talking about earlier. This is for our next book, where we've very, very carefully controlled the images. I've never spoken to these slides before, but basically, the two green ones here, 26 and 35, find this more attractive than that. So we're getting a very, very strong preference for a more highly articulated arcade. This one, actually I'll jump over that because I haven't got time. Here again, we very carefully controlled here. So we're trying to have the same number of people, greenery at the same level, sky the same. And again, we're getting much stronger preference for this versus this. And again, we've done this very carefully, working with Maury and with scientists. We get a less strong here. So this is interesting. This shows it isn't just about facade pattern. So this one is actually beating this one. So we're not getting a completely consistent picture, but then again we get, this one is much more attractive than that. So we're getting there's some nuances in it, and other things can top it if it feels scary, but the facade pattern really works. I'm going to jump over that because it's hard to talk to. But I'd say do you remember I said that we'd looked at 19,000 streets or squares, and we'd mapped which were the most popular. These are two of the most popular places in London, according to the computer. And others have very similar things. They've got a bit of greenery, and they've got a traditional facade pattern behind it. The ones that score just a little bit lower just have less greenery in front of the traditional facade pattern. And the least popular places are long, are grey, have very non-elevated facades. Do I need to stop soon? Let me just say one more thing on value, because this matters. I think I said earlier that we'd looked at every single property sale in 6 British cities. Here are the results for London. The developers don't like this. So these blue bars we're able to disentangle the value of a property. If you have enough property, you can statistically work out what's driving it. And what we found was, if you can imagine, look at that number there, the offering of pre-1900 properties, 58,397. What that means statistically, and this doesn't make sense in reality, but it does make sense statistically. If you can imagine two identical properties in the same, or anyway, in a bit of a city that is a similar distance to the middle and is easy to get to, and everything else is the same, but one of them is surrounded by lots of properties built before 1900, and the other one isn't. The first one, statistically, is worth £60,000 more, just because of that. If you have a building in London in 2016, identical to another one, but closer by a certain amount to a listed or protected historic building, it's worth £50,000 more. There's another one here. Intersection density. That's a measure of a traditional street pattern. 60,000 or 57,000. Here's the new build premium. So two identical properties, one's new and one isn't. The new one's worth £8,795 more. It's peanuts. The value that we put on place, on urban form, on the ability to pop out to the shops, to walk around the corner, to see something beautiful when you go to the shops or down the street, is of immense value, and people value it. This is not based on a sample. This is based on every single property sale in London. Another thing we found, when we looked at index of multiple deprivation, measure of poverty, we could predict the poor areas. They were lower density, but with lower ground space coverage and higher density. Not modernism. So areas with lots of open space and high density. That's a modernist development. It was the most consistent finding across every single city. In every city, it was a confident and strong predictor of poorer areas. Now, I'm not blaming the poor people, quite the opposite. They don't have the power to choose, because they don't have enough money to live where they would most want to live. They are the victims of modernism, not the other way around. One other study, this is a Dutch study, this is a marvellous study, done on the Vinex urban extension programme over the last 20, 30 years. And what's interesting about that is they're all very conventional urban extensions. And a lovely piece of research published 2 years ago grouped them, you'll like this in Interbow, into traditional developments, i.e. looking like they're old, sort of traditional in the middle, and modernist. They're all walkable extensions. They're all quite urbanistically good. The traditional ones, holding everything else constant, were worth 15% more. The ones in the middle were worth 5% more than the modernist ones. The modernists were the least valued. So the developers and the planners and the architects are literally taking value out of the scheme. So that's why you should be doing more work, because you bring more money to the land, to your clients. And he's not paying me to say that. I think I'll just say one thing about sustainability, because this is very important. There have now been 2 studies, again we were talking about this earlier, there have been 2 studies, one in London and one in Hong Kong, of very high buildings and energy usage. Now, there's a very good case for high density, which is it does lead to higher sustainability of transport patterns, which is absolutely true. And we strongly support that. But when you look at density delivered through towers, it then leads to a disbenefit of less energy efficiency within the building itself, because the energy usage per metre cubed goes up the higher the building is. The most energy efficient way to deliver the density of transport benefits is back to that fine-grained, medium-rise urban density. You can get easily up to anywhere between 170 and 300 homes per hectare, but without the disbenefits of the wind effects and the high exposed surfaces. So there we go. That says what I've just said. Here are the images. This is the perfect urban development for people's well-being. Facade patterns, steps, trees, walkable, beautiful, mixed use, and we should be creating streets, building beautiful, gentle density. Thank you very much indeed.